Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Creation, a faith journey for small groups. I'm so glad you decided to continue the journey. Today we're still in a rocky part, all right? Today in segment 1B, we're going to look at the fact that there are deadly serious risks just ahead if we continue to do what we've been doing. And we're going to ask the question, why? Why would we continue to do what we do? Okay? What are these deadly risks? Well, we're setting in place triggers across the globe that will greatly accelerate the global warming crisis, the sustainability crisis. As we melt the snow in the Arctic, more sun gets absorbed and we melt it faster. And eventually we thaw out the Arctic and we releases millions and millions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane, which accelerates it. If we keep acidifying the oceans, we're going to affect the life cycle of the oceans. And then how do people live? In fact, the situation is so dangerous right now. There are scientists who are deciding what interdictory measures do we have to put in. What measures do we have to take to try and turn the earth away because we haven't done it voluntarily. So there's some really crazy ideas. There's ideas from having a fleet of airplanes in the upper atmosphere spraying out sulfide crystals to reflect the sunlight back up. There's other ideas about putting iron into the oceans to counter the acidity that we're putting in there. There's all kinds of ideas of messing with how God created the earth. Is that wise? You know, our new Secretary of State, when he was head of a major oil company, said, climate change is real, but we can adapt to it. Can we? Isn't that a certain amount of hubris to say that no matter what we do, we can adapt to it? It isn't simply a matter of adding on more air conditioners or building higher break walls to keep the floods out. No, it's much more than that. There's some wisdom in the Bible that we ought to spend a little time with because it addresses the hubris of humankind to think they know more than God. It comes to us from the book of Job. If you remember Job, the human that had never sinned, suffered all these calamities, but most of the chapters surrounds Job with a few friends, supposed friends, who are telling him how he must have messed up. And finally, after 38 chapters, we hear the voice of God speaking out of a whirlwind. Let's go there now. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have an understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heaven beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? In Job, God is saying, who are you that question how I made the earth's life systems? Who are we to think that we know more than God? Who are we that think that we can spray stuff in the atmosphere or in the oceans or build higher dams and everything will be all right? Who are we to have such hubris, to know what the outcomes of doing such stuff might be? It's time we had a little humility. We're going to spend some time with our wisdom leaders exploring this, exploring the very real risks if we don't stop what we're doing. Our life for our kids and our grandkids is going to be a life of agony. Let's hear what they have to tell us.
But the other side of it that I think is really important in terms of justice issues is twofold. One, the rate at which we consume in what we call first world countries. Consuming products at a rate and cheaper and more inexpensively has a direct impact on our neighbors that we're called to serve and love. It exacerbates and fuels things like sweatshop labor, inequality in the labor force, enslavement of people still today so that we can have cheaper products. Now we might not we might be ignorant of where they came from or how they were formed, but gosh darn it, we like to go to our specials. I'm not going to name any stores, but we like to get our discounts and, you know, our $5 t-shirts. But that's a problem because somewhere at the root of that line, it's affecting our brothers and sisters in ways that mean that they live is just barely, if at all, sustainable. Climate change affects the poorest of the poor.
The first and the worst.
Yeah, the companies, I've just been working with my church on the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Sioux and Lakota Indians and the tribal nations from across the country who are protesting this pipeline as it goes through their traditional heritage hunting grounds, burial grounds, and water access sites. If there's a leak in this oil line, fracked oil by the way, it will contaminate the drinking water for the whole reservation. And not that these people weren't poor as it was. Now, because the pipeline's being rerouted, it's you know, who cares about these Indians, basically? We're just going because we can, because we've put them on this land originally. Now we can just go back and take what we want because we can. And I see this scenario played out in many corners of the world where the poorest of the poor, their neighborhoods become dumping grounds and landfills. There's no access to healthy food choices from many of our poorest inner city neighborhoods. Our food supply, all these things impact the care of creation, how we grow food, how we produce food, what we put into our food. So it's multifaceted. I think you've heard, you know, the use of our water streams and systems, food sources, the way we use energy, and what our energy sources are. All these things impact all of God's children. And I think whether you have, right now, the wealthiest can hide behind it and move to the higher ground or the most desirable places.
Crank up the air conditioning.
But there will come a time when the air quality will, you know, if we reach tipping points, you can have all the money in the world and it won't matter.
This is what I would say is that due to the damage that's been done to our climate, we are now in a situation where in the United States we're getting a partial glimpse of what a lot of other parts of the world are already experiencing in terms of severe weather patterns. It could be the hurricane that just hit Haiti and North Carolina. It could be the drought in California and parts of Africa, what they're experiencing in terms of drought conditions. All of these severe weather events are increasing in frequency. So you can talk to our disaster relief director here at the UCC, and he'll tell you about the tremendous increase in disasters that have occurred because of climate change, essentially. Increasing the frequency and the severity of these disasters. And what's been said is that climate change is really a water issue. It's too much or too little. As the air warms, it holds more water and dumps more water, and so therefore we see lots more flooding. You see energy and higher sea levels making hurricanes worse, so that we're having more powerful hurricanes because the heat energy feeds into these hurricanes, making them more powerful and severe. So all of these things are occurring. They're having a bigger impact often on the global south and particularly islands, and so it's exacerbating global inequalities that the countries that are already considered the most impoverished countries of the world are sadly the countries that are also getting hit the hardest by climate change. The people who have contributed the least to climate change are the ones who are most impacted by climate change. And so Desmond Tutu has been a strong voice in pointing this out. He's noted early on that a 2-degree rise in temperatures in the United States would be a 4-degree rise in temperatures in Africa, which would have a devastating impact on small farmers. Just a 1-degree rise has a tremendous agricultural impact on our world, and we see already the tremendous expanse of desert areas around the world that are taking away more and more agricultural land. And so these are things that might not be on the conscious radar for a lot of people in the United States, but they're having real impacts already in the world. And so it's something that we will become increasingly aware of as time goes on, because we can't stay insulated. That's the interconnected nature of our world, is that we can only, with our wealth and power and geographical, the happenstance of geography, stay insulated from this so long. And people are already, as we saw recently with the flooding in North Carolina, people are already suffering and in some cases dying as a result of these severe transformations in our weather. So all that is something that's becoming, I think, a reality that people are more and more becoming aware of just in their daily lives.
There's a thing we call the carbon bubble. And the carbon bubble is based on the concept, just like all economic bubbles are, that something has great value as long as it's perceived to have great value. And once that perception is popped, when the bubble pops, then all that accumulated wealth disappears. In the carbon bubble, what we pretended is that we can burn endless amounts of oil and coal and gas, the fossil fuels. We pretended that. And we pretended that it doesn't harm anything. Although we know in truth, the World Health Organization tells us 5 to 8 million people die every year from air pollution, from burning oil and coal and gas. But now we've reached the point where we're building up in the atmosphere that pollution, that carbon level that's heating up the earth. And as a result, we're causing strange and dangerous things to happen to the earth's life systems. And one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to reach a point, and the argument over how soon, but it's coming soon. We're going to reach a point where we realize that we can't continue to burn the oil, the coal, and the gas. And once we do that, those trillions of dollars of assets that are on the books of the oil companies and the gas companies and the coal companies suddenly have to be written off. And those richest companies in the history of money suddenly have no value. That's why they're fighting this. That's why they're fighting this. But before we reach that point, there's going to be another bubble. And that's going to be the bubble that's based on prime real estate on the coastlines. So if we look at all of these buildings, all of these hotels and motels and vacation condo shelters and all this high-priced real estate, it's going to come to a time, and the time is going to be very shortly, where those very buildings, that very real estate, is going to be threatened by massive storms that arise out of the oceans and by the rise of the oceans themselves. Who wants a multi-billion dollars worth of real estate when it's flooded, when it's destroyed by storms? When that realization sinks in, then all the people that own and invested the money into that suddenly turns to zero wealth. But until then, we have a bubble. And the thing is about economic bubbles is everybody plays the game. It's kind of like the lotto. They want to be the last one out of the game, thinking that they're smart enough to be in there just to the right minute and then get their money out. That was the crisis of the 2008 housing crisis. It doesn't work that way. The bubble's coming. Florida's governor might forbid state employees from talking about climate change, but it's real, it's coming. And the tourist industry is going to be threatened. You're not going to be able to get insurance to protect your house to protect your hotel and to protect your building against the rising of the seas and the storms that's unleashed. Those bubbles are going to pop. That's scaring all that money. We're at a time of great risk right now. A time where we're threatening the extinction of massive amounts of the animal and plant life on this planet. We're seeing it across the globe already. We're seeing it in the killing off of the coral reefs, which are responsible for the living of half the fish species, but also the living of 500 million people across the globe that depend on those. And the risk is threatening to escalate because we're melting the poles at a much faster rate than we had thought. The snow and the ice is bright and shiny and reflects back the sun, but as you melt that, and the land, the dark land, gets exposed and absorbs more of the sunlight, and you have an escalating heating up and releasing the trapped methane and carbon that's underneath that frozen tundra. If this happens at an ever-growing rate, then we tip over in what we call runaway reactions, which melts the ice and raises the sea levels even faster, which causes even greater storms as more heat is exposed. And we can see temperature maps across the globe and the concentration of the heat up in the North Pole area and the threat of melting Greenland. But we're also affecting Antarctica. And Antarctica is responsible, if it would melt, for hundreds of feet of sea level rise. That's putting major population centers at risk in the next few decades. And that risk translates to a great threat enhancer. In fact, the number one threat enhancer is rated by our Department of Defense. Why? Because as countries experience this and they have the national disasters and emergencies, people get desperate. They get desperate for their children. They get desperate to find food for them and water for them and land that they can live on that's not underwater or in the midst of deep, deep droughts. And so conflict grows, civil unrest grows, and threatens the national security of individual nations, which then in turn threatens the global security. We've experienced some terrible wars in our time. We've paid the horrible human price of suffering when we haven't solved the crisis before it reached that stage. We can't go back in time and change what led up to World War I and World War II, but maybe we can learn from those conflicts. Maybe we can have the wisdom to know that if we don't act when a crisis is developing, then the human cost, the human suffering reaches tragic proportions. Can we learn from that before we add more names to a memorial wall, before we plant more graves and white stone markers in great vast fields as more of our men and women come home in body bags? Can we learn from previous wars and the crisis that led up to them? Can that learning cause us to act now before we have to plant more fields of white tombstones? Can we learn? Can we prevent World War III by stopping the climate crisis right now? Wouldn't it be worth the price? Wouldn't it be worth the price of a little economic investment? And what does it mean? As Mark Carney says, the vast majority of carbon reserves are unburnable. If the world is going to avoid conflict and destruction, all that oil and coal and gas has to be kept right where it's at, deep in the ground, not burning it. Can we do this?
How much time do we have to actually, make a big difference. So some of us think, well, geez, I might lose $40,000 from 3 pledges if I preach this sermon. I'm not suggesting that everybody, risk the whole kit and caboodle, over the next 2 weeks. But there has to be a way in which we become a different church in relation to this issue. There has to be a way in which we bear a different witness in relation to this issue. I just don't know how to say it any differently. It turns out the earth is the Lord's and we are the church and we have desecrated creation. I mean, isn't it? It's pretty simple. So if the church can't stand up against the desecration of creation, which in a few decades is going to be permanent and irredeemable, then how do we get to call ourselves the church? And the fact that the church hasn't done it in the previous it wasn't at risk in the previous 2,000 years. It's at risk now. Okay, I'm sorry, I got a little wound up there.
Next up is a Telling It Forward segment on a specific action item that we would like you to include in your discussion today. It's one of 6 that you should be discussing, but it's going to go deeper into this one to give you an idea on how the other 5 might also be looked at. Don't neglect the other 5, but for right now, sit back and take in the truth of this one. So let's spend some time focusing on action item 11. And what is 11? It kind of builds off the one we talked about last time, but this one has to deal with neighbors and friends. So this action item says, tell family, friends, and neighbors why the climate crisis is an issue of real concern to you. I know the immediate reaction to that is I can't do that. If I tell family we'll just have a messy dinner. If I tell neighbors, well, they're not going to come over to the fence to talk anymore. If I tell friends, they're going to think I'm wacky. Here's the thing. All the scientists in the world won't convince us to change our lives. What convinces us to change the way we live is that somebody that we respect, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, tells us that this issue is so important they're willing to risk being rejected by saying the difficult truth. The climate crisis is real. It's happening now. It's human caused, and we have to respond to it. It's kind of like being a light into the world. If we look at the start of John's gospel, John talks about coming of John the Baptist. He says, there was a man sent by God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. When we tell our friends, our family, and our neighbors the truth about the climate crisis, we are part of the light, so that others might believe the truth through our personal witness. I know it's hard to do, at least initially, because I tell you, once you start doing it, once you get over the raised eyebrow and the look askance, because you're doing this for your kids and for your grandkids, you'll find more and more people will say, you know what? If you're concerned about it, then I'm going to have to start taking it serious. You know what? If it matters that much to you, then maybe I ought to be concerned about my kids and my grandkids. You know what? Thanks for sharing. Because I've been wanting to do that too, and I haven't had the courage. And seeing your example gives me that courage. That's our action item for today. Can you do that? Sure you can. Tell a friend, tell a neighbor, even tell your family. Okay, you can leave out cranky Uncle Joe for a while. You're not going to change his mind anyway. But you can tell people who care about their kids and their grandkids, and they will listen to you. They're just looking for somebody they trust to tell them this difficult truth. The climate crisis is real. It's happening now. It's human caused, and we have to act now. That's your action item. Start working. So that wraps up our video session for today. What's up next is for your discussion. That's every bit as important, if not more important, than all that we laid out before you. So gather together as a group. Spend some time with the scripture, but give yourself lots of time to dialogue about what you've seen and what you've heard, what has touched you, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Take the time to listen very deeply to the wisdom each other shares. You never know when God is going to speak using another person's voice to give you a truth that you do not yet have. And then last but not least, in your discussion group, spend time with the 6 action items that we have in today's handout sheet. Until next time, enjoy the journey. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Terry Gallagher. See you further along the way.